Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's CPD webinar, A Hack into Cybersecurity, Corporate Governance and Organizational Resilience, hosted today by Janet Schulst of our Quebec branch. A little bit about the Chartered Governance Institute. It has evolved into an organization for governance professionals in Canada and is committed to strengthening and advancing good governance and the efficient administration of organizations in Canada. Unique to governance organizations, we are part of an international network that supports over 29,000 members living and working in over 80 countries. Here in Canada, we offer two renowned programs for certification. The programs are the International Qualifying Program, a globally recognized and intensive program which standards set by the international body. We also have the Director's Education and Accreditation Program. It's a 3-day intensive program focused on providing board directors and governance professionals the skills they need to perform their roles effectively. The DEEP program offers knowledge in areas of governance, financial reporting, disclosure, risk management, and strategy. Not only do we offer two world-renowned educational programs, we also deliver our CPD webinars. But most importantly, we have an e-community where like-minded individuals can share information, ask questions, and continue their journey of lifelong learning. For more information about all these programs, our e-community and social media accounts, visit our website. I will also be posting links in the comment box throughout the presentation that you can follow. Without further delays, my pleasure now to present our Quebec branch representative, Janet Schulst. Thank you, Janet.
Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the CGIC's Quebec branch, I'd like to welcome you to our part 2 of our cybersecurity series. For those of you who didn't have a chance to attend our first session in November of last year, you can find it at CGIC's YouTube channel. I'm sure it's no surprise to any one of us today that cybersecurity is one of the most important risks that companies face today. In today's session, Yves Duguay will talk to us about what boards can do to create and build organizational resilience and prepare to respond quickly and effectively to cyber attacks. And Camilo Baratto will take us through a deep dive on the crucial role of ensuring cyber risk, what's covered, what's not, and a breakdown of the domains within a cybersecurity risk assessment. I'm sure today's session will be quite interesting for all of us and give us food for thought as to what boards need to be asking and how they can ensure they are protected as much as possible for when they fall victim to a cyber attack. As Yves and Camilo have a lot of ground to cover today, I won't present their bios as they were included in the invitation. But without further ado, I will pass the virtual microphone on to Yves. Yves?
Thank you very much, Janet. Let me grab the presentation here. Now you're going to have to, like in any good issue with technology, I'm just trying to see how I can backtrack. This is the second slide. Camilo, you're more familiar on Zoom than I am. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. So good afternoon. Thank you, Janet, for this introduction. Cyber risk is not an IT problem. It's a governance issue and a major business risk that can affect the sustainability of your organization. As such, it should be addressed by both the CEO and the board of directors. IT security in the best context should be governed in a formal framework that will protect the organization and allow it to achieve its objective. Today, I'd like to share with you my perspective on the issue. It's a different take on information security, not from a specialist, but rather from someone who has managed emergency situation, crisis, and major incidents. As a matter of fact, I come from more of a security and compliance background. But recently I decided to improve my understanding of this complex world that is IT security, drawing from my experience of enterprise risk management. Based on this experience in risk assessment, it is my belief that the cyber threat may not be accurately identified or assessed by many companies. Furthermore, the impact from most scenarios, in my view, may be undervalued. This inaccurate assessment is compounded by a knowledge gap between the board of directors and the specialists in the executive team responsible for IT security. The world of IT security is very complex. It's full of acronyms, even worse than civil aviation. And new security technologies are emerging as quickly as the pace of microchips. In this context, it is important that the IT executive be an excellent communicator to vulgarize and make accessible the information concerning the nature of the threat and how it is being managed. IT security is also affected by our understanding, or I should say maybe misunderstanding of risk management. I think that all of us here this afternoon can agree that there's no such thing as 100% effective security system or solution, whether it is a physical or a digital solution. Consequently, regardless of how well structured our preventive and protective IT security architecture is, there is a level of residual risk, and it's very high in cybersecurity, that cannot be eliminated or transferred. So in the case of cyber attacks, this residual risk being so high is you will be breached. There's no issue about that. Your companies will be breached. It's no longer if a known attack or a new one will be able to escape detection and impact your assets and your client's assets. It's rather when, how often it will repeat itself, and how severe it will be. So as board members, you are being asked, firstly, to ensure that the business strategy will enable your organization to deliver on its mission and achieve its objective. On the other hand, you must also ensure that whatever could derail this strategy, the enterprise risk in this case, are managed effectively. So this afternoon, what I'd like to cover with you is the following: is to position, first of all, cyber risk in relation to enterprise risk management. Then we'll talk about the difference between cybersecurity and cyber resilience and how resilience can actually create value. And then I'll suggest some knowledge-based solution, investing in knowledge with a high return on investment. Just like for climate change, I'm not certain that the current cyber risk environment has been correctly identified or assessed as part of the enterprise risk management process. Certainly the cybersecurity statistics that are available from security organization or from specialized publications support that point of view. So for this presentation, what I've done is I've used one of McKinsey's publication to propose a strategic enterprise risk management matrix, very high level, 30,000 feet, focusing on the ability to anticipate, which is essential in building a resilient security program. I prepared this diagram from a review of the literature, available statistics, and my own experience. As a result, I've identified the risk which, in my view, should be of most concern to you and me as well. So there's no doubt in my mind that we should anticipate and plan for a high frequency of confidential data theft, especially from internal sources, your own employees and contractors, just like the Desjardins case in Quebec. We should anticipate persistent, common, and systemic cyber attacks. And as these attacks escalate, we should expect the regulator to react in consequence, and more requirements and non-compliance issues, especially in the field of privacy and the reporting of breaches and loss of data. This explains the red tags that I positioned on the diagram. In risk assessment, you must address both the frequency and the impact to assess the overall level of risk. The surge in frequency of attacks and the escalated impact on organization, I believe, is linked directly to the attackers' increased capacity to easily and covertly launch attacks with readily available tools found in the open market and on the dark web. The attackers, criminals, or state sponsors know and understand the value of your informational assets, your data, including proprietary information. They know how to exploit your vulnerabilities, to find and exfiltrate the data, and then to monetize it. So not only are they stealing your valuable assets for their illicit gains, but they're also causing a great deal of losses for your companies, especially when you consider both direct and indirect costs. And as Camilo would explain in this part of the presentation, insurance can reduce its impact to a certain extent, but it will not compensate for the damage to your brand. Statistics in cybersecurity are like numbers. You can make them say anything. So even though there's a high level of variance sometimes among the sources of statistics concerning cybersecurity and cyber attacks, the fact remains that there are trends that remain the same throughout these statistics. Firstly, that the threat is significant and persistent, and that's not going to go away. It is evolving rapidly, shifting, adjusting, and adjusting to bypass our defensive infrastructures. And the impact in financial terms is growing at an exponential rate, a bit like investments in IT. So the point that is very important that I want to stress to you this afternoon is the attacker's capacity has been industrialized. It is a partly now legitimate and partly illegitimate business or industry whose sole purpose and focus is to steal from you and to hamper your competitiveness. Indeed, there are now, and we have now, engineers and companies, legitimate companies that are building and selling software strictly meant to probe your vulnerabilities, to facilitate attacks on your organization. This is a kind of software, by the way, that was used recently to probe vulnerabilities in SCADA for the equipment of a water filtration plant in Florida, which thankfully was detected in time as it may have caused death and illnesses. Another case in point of this industrial capacity is demonstrated by the recent SolarWinds cyber attack. This, at least in my view, is the perfect example to show and to demonstrate what we're facing. In this case, an extremely sophisticated and stealthy attack that has been engineered to bypass layers of security system, to hide from filters and detection tools, and to go to sleep until it can be activated by the hacker to steal data or to ransom you for that data. So what we should learn from an attack like this is that we're facing a lopsided threat, just like for terrorism and civil aviation. So our current approach may not be adequate to withstand the consequence of these forms of attack and the impact on our business, where systems could become unavailable, where the confidentiality and integrity of the informational assets could be tainted or compromised. So considering the frequency, the impact, the severity of the consequence on the sustainability, the reputation, the survival of the company, security and resilience may actually become some of the most serious issues for the CEO and the board to manage as part of their fiduciary duties and responsibilities. This is exemplified by the numerous attacks that have resulted in the firing of senior executives, including CEOs, as in this study published by Gartner. This is particularly important for board of directors, as one of your key roles is to select and assess the CEO's performance and to plan for succession. Considering the uncertainty and the complexity of the risk environment in which we operate, we should review the current IT security strategy, shifting from a static stance to a resilient and predictive approach. If resilience is indeed what the outcome that we're seeking or that we wish for, we then must manage a high level of residual risk of cyber attacks upstream. That's in part one of this diagram. Through preparedness and a collaborative mindset supported by an effective and tested business continuity program. By the way, this is a graphic for the COVID-19 response to crisis, but it can be used, in my view, for the management of most crises. Unfortunately, regardless of the preventive and protective measures in place, the high number of vulnerabilities in the IT system will continue to be exploited by attacks that will be targeting deficient technologies such as a misconfigured firewall, an outdated antivirus, an unpatched server, or a weak VPN protocol. Keep in mind that we, the users, we are the main or major vulnerability that is exploited time after time by hackers, as seen through the massive phishing email campaigns that are responsible for more than half of all breaches. IT security must not only be on the lookout for past attack, but it must also prepare, it must anticipate for a new form of attacks and viruses. Unfortunately, just like we do right now with the public health sector at this time of COVID-19. At some point, investments in technology will be maximized and spending more money will not increase the capacity to prevent, detect, and stop the attack. This is probably why we should look at reviewing where we put our efforts and resources, such as using a formal governance structure, a bit like ISACA or ISO, to manage and to frame IT security programs. Leveraging AI and smart technologies to develop and identify precursors to detect unusual technical and human behaviors, and taking into account available intelligence that are shared by government entities. And this is just like the CISA bulletin that I showed you earlier concerning the SolarWinds attack. We must also plan for emergency response and incident management, designing and activation of contingencies and the triggering of business continuity in a degraded mode. So in the future, this is how companies may well gain a competitive advantage through resilience by developing a capacity to withstand recurrent and new attacks, to return to business operation effectively and quickly, and speed will be a major factor. Finally, cyber resilience must be developed, tested, and exercised to learn and evolve continuously to improve. It is a mindset that should be championed and communicated by the CEO and the board of directors. And remember that when we will conduct postmortem after a major incident, a breach, or a data loss, we will not only be judged on our diligent efforts and the reasonableness of our actions, but also on how effective and how quickly we were able to react and intervene, how prepared we were. So if your company was attacked tomorrow by a malware like SolarWinds, how prepared would you be to face this threat and to recover from it? How defensible is your strategy? You will remember that in one of the previous slides, I questioned whether the current cybersecurity approach can be considered sustainable, considering the huge increase in IT security budget witnessed over the past year. The answer, I guess, depends very much on the industries and the companies. But if we take a look at recent research studies, as in this slide, you will see that investing in preparedness, speed, and resiliency will yield huge dividends. And this is something to keep in mind when you consider the vast sum invested in business digitization. That's a tough one for me to say, sorry, digitization and IT infrastructure to increase productivity and to reduce losses. If these systems are not available, regardless of the money you've sunk into these systems, if the integrity and the confidentiality of the informational assets have been tainted, how does that serve your business objective and your client's need? So security should be built into this approach to digitizing the business processes. For example, you wouldn't buy a $100,000 car without insurance, and you don't want your house to be the only one in the street without a burglar's alarm. So this is the kind of protection that you should expect from a cyber resilient approach to complement your formal coverage of insurance, which Camilo will address during his presentation. And remember that the criminals and the terrorists will always follow the least path of resistance, and you don't want to be that path of resistance. So that's why you should invest in knowledge. You should invest in security awareness and collaboration with your critical partners. Awareness, training, exercising, and testing go hand in hand and are essential components of a cyber resilience approach. Furthermore, the nature of the threat you are facing nowadays requires a collaborative response involving the authorities and your key partners in your supply chain. In the case of the SANS Security Awareness Training Program, which is you see on this slide, it's a program that is formalized. So it's a system, there's a system behind it, and it can be designed and adjusted based on the level of maturity that you're seeking. A bit like the CMMI scale that we use to assess the maturity of the IT security programs. So to me, there's no doubt in my mind that security awareness training and exercises will yield the highest return of investment for any company, as it focuses on the most important vulnerability of any organization, ourselves. So in conclusion, let me turn the table on you and leave you with two questions, or actually 2.5 questions. So ask yourself, how you presented and provided with the right information at the right time and at the right forum. Remember that what I asked earlier, if your company was attacked tomorrow, how would you fare? Are you also asking the right questions, again, in the right forum and committee? Keep in mind that Gartner predicts that by 2025, roughly 50% of the companies will create a separate committee solely to address the IT issue. So I want to thank you for your attention and for taking the time to attend this presentation today. And I'll turn the microphone over to Camilo. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. I will also put up my presentation. Thanks again, Yves. So as you mentioned, and as mentioned by Janet, I had gone through in the past webinar a bit of a high level of the insurance aspect of cybersecurity. Today, I'll bring forward some of the language to assist in understanding the conversation that could be held when discussing the topic at a board meeting. And in order to do this, I have broken up the subject as it would in a risk assessment document. So I hope that that you find this useful. But right before I do that, I do want to go over one thing that I did present it last time, but I want to show you what would be covered. A lot of the questions that come in is what would be covered by a standard cybersecurity insurance policy. And so in my next slide here, you see here that we have two aspects of an insurance policy. You have the operating aspect, the operational risk, and then the privacy and network security risk being covered. So one is a first party coverage, which is making sure that your business interruption in case of a system failure is covered. If you do have cyber extortion, that would be covered as well. And then the second aspect is the third party coverage, which is if you do lose a bit of data of your suppliers, of your customers, of your employees, that you're covered for that as well. Actually, even recently, as a couple of days ago, a question that was asked to our brokers is, when our suppliers do come in and use our VPN accesses and things like that, are we covered if we ever cause problems to them? And in most cases, those policies would come in and cover that as well. So that is something that I just wanted to touch on before I dive into my next slide and diving into the risk assessment. So I have taken a sample risk assessment that was usually performed by a third party and is validated usually by the CIO as well. The risk assessment needs to start by describing the entity being assessed by compiling what we call the company's IT footprint. This is done before we can then identify the scoring methodology, and then with the two aforementioned points here, we can then open up to our terminology and the domains and fields that help us understand the subject a bit better. These domains are quantified and benchmarked, hopefully against industry peers. And this quantification then leads to the prioritization of risks in order to not only measure the cyber risk within an organization, but also to create a roadmap for early and long-term wins. So reporting and measurement of these is what follows. But once we start from somewhere solid and everybody's aware as to what that score is, it's going to be easier for the board to ask pertinent questions as to how come we haven't advanced in this domain and how come we've excelled in others. So my next slide will show the company and terminology profile, which I mentioned earlier is of great importance. The profile of an organization, obviously, it's what gives underwriters in insurance a bit of a glimpse. So in general information, we need to be accurately described for those insurers to know what risk they're purchasing from us. So critical applications such as ERPs, human resource information systems need to be identified. And the same goes for internal control. Sensitive and confidential data needs to be recognized. Sometimes we have internal servers, sometimes we hire third parties to host our data. So those are all important items that go into the risk assessment that needs to be really provided so people know what type of risk we're talking about before even getting into the domains. And that now understanding where we stand in an assessment is important to be able to know where we are and where we're going to be. But I like to break down in a further slide the different domains that are scored on, but to be able to know if the organization is in the initial, basic, managed, or advanced stage of cybersecurity. The scale that you see here, helps to be able to overall, when you get to the end of the assessment, understand where you may be. So you'll see how this is done looking at the domains that follow. In the scoring methodology proposed, in the slide before, I propose an overall score of 2.2, just to use as an example. How do we get to a basic stage for a given organization would be the question. Well, we need to drill down into each domain and ask the technical questions. This is done, as I said, by a third party with our IT team, and they drill down, but without getting too much into the woods. Still, just giving these domains give you a bit of a view as to what each of these have. So those are data security, access control, endpoint system security, security, network and physical security, application security, and third party and resilience. So a little bit of what Yves talked about. Resilience is part of that. Everybody wants to know if we're ready to respond, not only to protect ourselves, but then to respond. So we go into a little bit of detail on each one. And you see here 4 of the ones that I mentioned earlier. So needing to break down the domains even further without losing the notion of terminology versus technicality. Our goal here is to still have or give a zoom into the terminology that could be used in the board without diving into the technical aspect that often a CIO would provide. So data security, you see it here at the top left. How is data protected? What are the policies in place? And has there been an awareness program provided to all our employees? That's the first domain. The second domain is the access control. Is there an access management revision, done, monthly, biannually, annually? Those are very important things to know. Do we have a 2-factor authentication for all remote access? And that is what touches access control. Endpoint and system security. Well, do we have an endpoint protection when entering our servers? Do we have a vulnerability detection program? And how do we score in this area specifically? That is endpoint. A lot of the times when I think about the endpoint and system security is the VPN access that I mentioned earlier as well. And then physical security. Do we have a security controls in place for our physical systems? How easy is it to enter our premises? Sometimes those are like very easy questions that need to be answered. And we if you can easily enter a facility and then easily access the servers, well, you're not doing really good in the physical security aspect of things. Moving on to the next 4, scores need to be established for the following as well. Network security. Do we manage excess capacity and bandwidth? What about wireless access systems? Do we test the network often enough? That is part of the network security domain. Right below each domain, you see those fields that I talked about. And each field then has, in any risk assessment, any given risk assessment, you could have 10, 20 questions related to that field. So just to let you know, and for anybody that's thinking of doing one, if you haven't done one yet, it is an extensive process. It could last. I think last time I spoke about how long it could take, and it all depends on the availability of the people within your IT departments. But each field could have weeks of work that go into it to provide the scores that you see here. I'm going to move on to the application security. Does the organization monitor and keep records of all applications? If an organization is just starting off to work on their cybersecurity, often they find hundreds of applications that have not been assessed for the threat and security that they may carry. So this is a lot of the people in businesses, as businesses grow, bring in applications to help their process. But over time, sometimes we don't do a cleanup, we don't do the inventory, and we don't look at those service providers that might own those applications. How are they protected, and do they pose a threat to us? So that's the application security domain. And third party is the next one, the infamous Target cyber attack. We may all be familiar with the Target. It became almost like a case study a few years back. And it was one of those attacks that was introduced by a third party. I believe it was also due to the connection that third party brought in, and then from there, a lot of the information was taken from the point of sale handhelds. So, how do we do the due diligence before having third parties coming in? Do we include these in our contracts as part of the risk transferring exercise? And does our organization track and monitor the setup of approvals of suppliers? And finally, the last domain here that I'll go over for this risk assessment type structure, business resilience, and that is retainers. I'll talk more in detail in the next slide, or in the next couple of slides. But this is an area where we need to be proactive and definitely not reactive. Yves went over that previously, but we often learn the lesson when we get burned. And Yves mentioned many high-profile executives losing their jobs, possibly because they were not prepared. So who do I need if I get attacked? You definitely do not want to be making random calls in the middle of the night during an attack, wondering who can help me. These services range from forensic investigators to law and communication firms. They're very important to either set up as retainers ahead of time, or I'll talk about how insurance policies sometimes carry these and how beneficial they could be in that case. Now I give you a global picture of the risk assessment. This is what it looks like after looking at all the domains, and within each domain, all the fields. When we plug it all in, I use this strictly as an example. This is not a risk assessment of anybody per se, but if you find yourself in the 2.2 category, well, out of 4, the board may need to set the realistic goal as to where do we want to be and where could we be, essentially, depending on the industry that we're in. Going back to the cybersecurity domain and the benchmarking that we need to do, we use benchmarking to identify areas of focus. So if we do this with notable agencies that can do this, they should have the data to be able to do this industry benchmarking. And then you see here on the right the gap that you may have with the others or the average in the industry. And that gives you a good priority listing as to where you could improve. So early wins by tackling the lowest scores could be an approach, but then I mentioned here a limiting factor. Yves also mentioned the budgets, IT security budgets, and those seem to be on the rise year after year. But then we have to always measure the cost of security solutions. We can't throw all our net income back into cybersecurity, obviously, so it needs to be well thought out. But this is just a good approach that the risk assessment could provide organizations. Then I touch on a little bit of that roadmap that you can create based on the findings of your risk assessment. And then this is just an example of a 18-month roadmap where you need to identify if you can be doing this internally, if you need someone external, and then track that over time to show maybe possibly the change of your 2.2 score onto higher. Again, I want to sort of mention that this scale is different service provider by service provider. So it depends if you're using a broker of insurance to do this work. IT departments tend to want to use more specific or more technical services. It could be consulting firms, or it could be also a lot of the accounting firms provide services like this as well. To touch on resilience, incident response providers and how do we get access to them? Well, that is, if you don't have cybersecurity insurance, it's something you need to get on your own. What does that mean? Sometimes engaging with procurement and looking for all those services that need to be there should you be attacked. And again, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be looking for these on the hour you're getting attacked. So you really need to tackle this way ahead of time. Talking about the services that do come with policies, well, underwriters are the ones that want you to be attacked the least. So they do already have the packages ready to go, and they try to get you connected with those service providers, and then you know who to call in case of an attack, which becomes a claim. You'd be opening the claim at the same time, and then they would deploy everybody that you would need. And so that's a lot of the reason. A lot of the times, is the reason you buy a policy is not for the limit it provides and the protection it provides. A lot of the times, a lot of people are buying low limits, but just they want to have the policy so they can provide benefit from these coverages and these services. So just to recap on the insurance side, you see that the assessment is not just a measure. It's to identify and measure the risk, to benchmark, and then to help improve the risk. Domains provide the fabric of the quantification and give the description to the risk. Also, this helps you communicate to the insurance market to be able to see what your cost would be to cover this risk. Improvements on that go year after year should also reduce a bit of your cost in that regard. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, just now, is sometimes the benefit of an insurance policy is really those bundled incident response services. So that was about it for my side. I know that we had possibly some questions for Yves' portion or my portion, I'm not sure if we mentioned this earlier, but we could do this through the chat, and people could put their questions there. We can tackle one by one. Or Kathleen, I'll let you take over at this point.
Okay, thank you. Janet, did you want to close first and then I can answer the questions?
Sure. So thank you to both Yves and Camilo for a great presentation, lots of information. And I'm sure we will all leave a little more informed, but probably also a little more wary and nervous of what we need to be looking at. So thanks to both of you again.
Great, thanks. And thank you everyone for taking the time out today. Are there any questions for either or Yves and Camilo? Feel free to post them or unmute yourself and ask one to them. Everybody's pretty quiet today. Oh, that was great. Thank you. There's some comments coming in now. So if anybody does have any questions, you can always email them to me at info@charteredgovernanceinstitute.ca, and I'll forward them on to our panelists, and they'll get back to you with any answers for them. All right, if nobody has any questions.
Maybe Yves or Camilo, if I had to ask you, what is the first question you would ask a board? So you've been invited to give a presentation on cyber risk to a board. What's the first thing you would ask them or tell them?
Do you want to start, or do you want me to start, Camilo?
Yes, I'll let you know.
Well, I think just a bit like the sequence and the presentation today is you have to have a pretty good sense of how they've assessed. Camilo explained very well in a detailed fashion how to assess the risk. So how was the risk assessed? Was this recently? What were the sources? What method was used? For example, there's a number of methods you could use. There's a ISO standard. There's a MEARI, which is from Europe, but which is taking a lot of place in Canada right now to assess IT risk. It's a very good system. So in terms of that, is to start with the IT risk. How has that impacted the company? Like, what were the past attacks? What were the attempted attacks? There's a lot of statistics that you can go and get that way. And that, what would be the worst scenario based on similar attacks that have taken place in the industry that which have paralyzed other companies. So again, my biggest question is based on the risk, based on the strategy that you put in place, if we're attacked tomorrow, how will we fare? And it's we always think I think that in a previous conversation Camilo and I had, is that when there's a major emergency, something like that, the government will advise you, well, you should put away enough food and water and everything else to make sure that you will withstand an attack, or you will withstand a certain condition. And not very many people do it. In the case of cyber attacks, the frequency and the impact being what it is, and as I said, the capacity of the attacker is scary right now. So if you're not planning on responding quickly and recovering effectively, the fact is you're going to be affected, and you're going to be on the losing side of it. And statistics are pointing in that direction. So it's a long way about to answer your question, because there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into account. But board members need to familiarize themselves with IT security and the lingo that goes along with it. I mean, they don't have to become an expert, but it's just like financial statements. You need to be able to read financial statement. You need to understand the basic about IT security. I'll pass it over to you, Camilo.
Thank you, Yves. No, and I was going to say, if I were to be presenting, and I would first probably ask them how much they know about the IT structure and just their knowledge, just to get a sense as to the audience that we'll be speaking to. And I know sometimes all boards have the one or two people that are a bit more specialized in understanding if at any of the domains they identify any areas of improvement, or if they've identified anything in their discussions that they feel the organization needs to be improved on, just as a starter. It would be one of the questions I would have, and before providing them a presentation, so to speak.
I do have a couple of questions now. So Leanne asks, do you find that most organizations have taken a cybersecurity policy? And she sends another one, says, particularly curious for smaller organizations. I guess with our discussion yesterday about our ransomware at my previous employer, they're thinking about this.
Sure. Yves, I'll start and I'll pass it on. But I think, well, more and more, definitely. I mean, the insurance market for cyber has grown exponentially. Really, it all depends. I think when we look at a smaller organization, it really looks at the risk appetite. So it's going back to what Yves said. If you have $100,000 car and you cannot pay that back to yourself, if it's something that you decided to buy for yourself and it's a really expensive car, you might want to insure it. So that's the risk appetite that people may have. Mind you, with a car, you don't have much of a choice. You have to insure it, but it's a good example. And for smaller entities, maybe the pricing, you put it out there, and it doesn't cost that much for smaller entities. It's just good to have, not necessarily for the limit, like I said, but all those services you might want to go and get on your own might be more expensive than having a policy that has those services. So that's just a comment that she might be able to take back home.
And I support entirely what Camilo just said. Basically it's a matter of risk and tolerance to risk. So what's your risk profile? What's your tolerance? What are you ready to accept? What's the size of your business? But most importantly, and I'll try it again, but if you're into the digitization, I think I got it this time, of services, well, then you're a target. You're going to be attacked. It's just a question of time. So it's really very much depending on the type of business that you're conducting. And as Camilo said, at some point the board has to be consistent with the CEO's approach and says, okay, this is our level of tolerance. Beyond this, we need to take action. And that's something that should be a fairly regular discussion around the board table.
Yeah. And just to touch on exactly, you just woke up a thought in my mind, Yves, and that's, we do think a lot about banking and a lot of different retail businesses that used to get impacted, but now more and more anybody, I worked for two big Canadian manufacturers, and in areas where you wouldn't think, and then when we've heard of in those areas that people were impacted. So more and more, it's not just retail, it's not just banking. A lot of people have it. So by providing just the, sometimes if you do have a broker, if you don't have a broker and you're going directly with insurers, providing them what you do could give you an indication. And for a smaller, I think if you do have critical systems, I think it's wise to have one, and more organizations are purchasing it. Yes.
Okay, Leanne says thank you. I don't have any more comments or questions, so thank you, Camilo and Yves, very informative. Okay, all right, everyone, we finished ahead of time, so thank you again for everybody, and Camilo and Yves and Janet for hosting all this, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next event on March 30th. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day and stay safe.